The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Good evening, people. We continue our discussion of neorealism by looking closely tonight at one classic instance of the neorealist movement, the single most famous film from that school, Bicycle Thieves. Before I turn to talking a bit about aspects of Bicycle Thieves itself, which I hope will frame your viewing in a way that will help you get a lot out of the first viewing of the film, I want to say a few words about Vittorio De Sica himself. I mentioned this afternoon that the neorealist movement, although it was immensely influential, and continues to be influential, in fact, on realist filmmakers and on documentarians, and it was, especially in its earliest phases, hailed globally as a very remarkable movement. It incited criticism almost from the beginning inside Italy. And I suggested this afternoon that some complaints against the movie essentially came from conservative forces in the society that felt that the portrait of decay and breakdown and dislocation that was at the center of neorealist films. After all, they were about the contemporary world and about the broken universe the broken planet, or at least the broken Europe that we encountered after the war. There were many conservatives who in Italy who felt that it promulgated a bad image for the society, that it made investment more difficult, that it was a kind of downer. And this criticism was very powerful. But what really undermined the movement in terms of getting financing, the reason that the movement sort of ended after about the time Umberto D., the last of the truly neorealist films that De Sica made, was produced in 1952. So its life was, very, very brief. That many people would say that was the end of neorealism, although there are some films that come after that that have neorealist dimensions and elements in them, including some by Fellini. Still, the idea that the movement had a very short life despite its immense influence is an accurate one. But what I had left out this afternoon is an important qualification or addition, which is that the films also incited criticism from the left. You would think that that's, when you see Bicycle Thieves, you'll see why that might be a surprising fact, because the sympathies of the film are so totally on the side of the underprivileged and the underclasses of the culture, that it's difficult from our contemporary vantage point to see what would have offended leftists. But there was a very vigorous and theoretically sophisticated communist movement in Italy in this period, as there continues to be today in some degree, many people on the left, especially communists, but socialists as well, also complained about neorealist films, and in particular about De Sica's films, because their complaint was not that the difficulties of the world were exposed. They were perfectly happy with that, but they were angry that there wasn't a program for renovation. What they were really angry about was that there wasn't a Marxist or a socialist program built into the films. And it's always struck me as a very revealing and interesting fact about the movement that it couldn't satisfy either left or right, even though these films are among the most powerful and compassionate films about the lives of ordinary, of not just ordinary people, but of people without power, of people without control over their lives, that have ever been made. So it's a curious fact, and it bothered De Sica all his life that he seemed unable to please either side in that political argument. And at one point in an interview, he said something. If I can find my notes, I'd like to quote to you. He said, in response to a question that asked him, why do you think the socialists and the communists were or at least some socialists? And remember, Zavattini was a socialist, so he collaborated deeply with and loved De Sica and collaborated with him on his most important films. So I don't mean that all socialists thought ill of neorealism. They did not. But some did, and certainly people on the far left definitely did. And here was de Sica's response to why. He said, he expressed disappointment about this, but his response really in a way is a critique of the programmatic demands that these people were making on his films. He said, "My films are a struggle against the absence of human solidarity." And you should think about this quotation as you're watching tonight's film, because as you'll see in the film, the official institutions of the society seem to have broken down, or at least to have become not effective. They're overburdened. They're somewhat indifferent. It's mostly that they're overburdened, that the problems of the society are too great for the institutional structures that are in place to handle the problems. But in any case, as you're watching the film, I think you'll notice not only clearly this breakdown of institutions that we might expect to be helpful to Ricci in his quest, but what we will also discover is that there are other forms of solidarity that emerge in the film. One of them is the solidarity of husband and wife. Another is the solidarity very much tested in the film. It's the great central theme of the film, the solidarity of father and son. And then there is also the solidarity of what we might call neighbors or neighborhoods. And you'll see how that element works toward the end of the film in its remarkable and surprising conclusion. Now, here's the quotation. "My films are a struggle against the absence of human solidarity, against the indifference of society towards suffering. They are a word in favor of the poor and the unhappy." And one reason I like the statement is it's so, in a certain sense, unsystematic. They seem to me to be the words of an artist, not a political pamphleteer. And they partly explain the richness, the resonance, what I've been calling the multiplicity of Bicycle Thieves. There's a moment in Bicycle Thieves about which André Bazin has written very beautifully, the same critic that was a champion of French poetic realism and of Jean Renoir, of course, becomes one of the great champions of Italian neorealism. He can see that the Italian form of realism is an extension and elaboration, and in some ways a deepening of the implications of poetic realism. And he's written brilliantly about the neorealists, and especially about de Sica. And there's one place in the film that he particularly focuses on in one of his essays. I have to give away a small part of the plot in order to explain this, but it really won't trouble you because the plot engine gets going so early in the film that it's hardly a surprise. And in fact, you really know what's going to happen almost from the opening dialogue in the film, where people are arguing about who has bicycles and who does not. The film is organized in a very elegant, relatively simple way. It covers essentially 3 days of time. The first day is the day that, in which Ricci gets the commission for the job, and then goes with his wife to get his bicycle out of hock. And you'll see that they have to go through certain kinds of tricks to find the money to do this. And then once he has his bicycle, he goes to work. And on his first day of work, guess what happens? Someone guess, who hasn't seen the film. What do you think might get stolen? Okay, right. His bicycle is stolen on the first day of work, okay? Now, the fact is, you're really not surprised when it happens, because almost from that first scene, you're aware that bicycles are this incredibly precious object in the world, and yet also incredibly common, and that's part of why it's such a resonant symbol in the film. But at the center of the film, the most fundamental and most memorable parts of the film involve what I'll call sort of the third segment. I don't know that the segments are actually equal in proportion in terms of time. I think the third is the longer one. But the third sequence is the odyssey, or the quest, in which Ricci and his young son embark on in order to recover his bicycle. So he spends the whole, I think he gets his job, gets his bike, starts his job on Friday, has his bike stolen on Friday, or maybe it's on Saturday. In any case, he then gets his bike stolen. He then asks for help from various sources, and the following day he spends the entire day walking through the city of Rome, looking for the thief, trying to find his bike. He actually finds the thief, as you'll see in the grand climax of the film, although the thief turns out to be as miserable and at least as much without prospects as poor Ricci himself. And something very interesting happens in that moment in the film, because your sympathies shift in some way to the thief in an odd way, and you watch as his neighborhood gathers around the thief to protect him in certain respects. So the heart of the film is this search that the father and the son go on through the third day of the plot, looking for the bicycle. And as the day wears on, the father becomes more and more nervous, more and more uneasy, more and more filled with anxiety. The bike seems to him the solution to all difficulties. And sometimes the son slows him down, and there are scenes in which the father becomes annoyed or angry with the son. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so I won't repeat this again, but I'll come back to these matters, the theme of fathers and sons. In any case, there's a moment in this odyssey where the father and the son are engaged in this search for the bicycle, when it's just after, I think it's exactly at a moment when there's a gigantic downpour. They're caught in a terrible rainstorm. I think, in fact, the rainstorm may have caused this. The boy has to pee very badly. And so he interrupts the quest to go and pee. I mean, you have to go. But the father's so upset that the boy has slowed him down that he slaps him. And it's like, you get a sense that it's maybe the first moment that this man has ever struck his son. I mean, it's a tremendously fraught moment. And this is how Bazin talks about it. And this is why I mention this moment now. It's a way of illustrating this principle of texture or openness to experience that's part of De Sica's vision of the world. He is a socially conscious director, but he's not a programmatic or a politically preachy director. So Bazin focuses on that moment I've just described to you, and he says, the boy needs to pee. A downpour interrupts the chase. Then he says, quote, the events are not necessarily signs of something, of a truth of which we are to be convinced. They all carry their own weight. The rain, the need to pee, the father's anger, right? They all carry their own weight, their complete uniqueness. They all have, Bazin says so finely, they all have that ambiguity that characterizes any fact. When a film is able to capture that ambiguity that characterizes any fact, it's a work of art. Right? It can't be programmatic if it does that. And in fact, the moment I'm describing is really, in some sense, a version of what I've been calling the neorealist counterplot. What constantly happens in good neorealist films, and what happens again and again in The Bicycle Thief, is that the ongoing quest for the bicycle is retarded or interrupted by various kinds of accident, disturbance, strange encounter. So that the search for the bicycle becomes something much larger than that. And every particular moment in the film has, as Bazin says, its own uniqueness. You don't feel that anything is in the film to further the plot, or to illuminate the character, or to tell you something about what political attitudes you should have. Although by the time you're finished with the film, you do have very coherent sense of how the society is breaking down, of how people are sustaining themselves, about how difficult life is in post-war Italy. You're aware of all of these things, and aware of them with a concreteness and a clarity that you wouldn't have if you'd read an abstract essay. You've seen them embodied in a totally believable fiction. But what gives the fiction its authority, what gives it its power, is precisely that you don't feel you're watching a sermon. You don't feel you're watching something in which some political moralist is beating you over the head and telling you, oh, you better love this poor guy. And in fact, as the film goes on, one of the things you discover is that there are nasty or bad sides to poor Ricci. We understand that he's driven by economic anxiety that's very deep, and it partly and certainly mitigates his behavior. But he behaves crudely and cruelly to his son, never intending to. And then, of course, there are moments when he recovers and tries to make up with his son. I'll come back to this in a moment. So this passage from Bazin also calls attention then to what I think of as a signal feature in these films, and especially in The Bicycle Thief, that power that any moment in the film has to express a kind of complete uniqueness, the ambiguity that characterizes reality itself. Well, What I'd like to briefly do is give you a partial account, a modest account of De Sica's own career, and then say some things about Bicycle Thieves. De Sica was a stage actor. He gave regimental performances when he served in the army in the First World War, became a stagehand right after the war, and an actor in 1923. He joined a theater company in 1925, a touring company, and he became a tremendous success in a series of performances. In 1927, he appeared on stage in Rome in something called the Zaboom Reviews, and I think it involves singing and dancing. This was an unbelievable success and turned him into a kind of matinee idol, or at least a theater icon. He made his first film in that same year, in 1922, as an actor. And his first success came, he continued to act in films intermittently for the next decade, but he didn't become a recognizably serious film actor until his first major success in 1932. And then for 10 years, he's a kind of matinee idol in Italian movies. He made over 40 films in the period as an actor between 1932 and 1942. A very handsome man, as some of you may know if you've seen him, and capable of great subtlety as an actor. This may help to explain why he was such a great director of non-professional actors, because he knew intuitively, I think, how to bring out a performance from someone who was not trained in performing, in acting. He begins to direct in 1940 and makes a series of interesting but forgettable films, I suppose. His first really significant film, from one angle anyway, especially if we're interested in the development of neorealism, is a film he makes in 1942, co-screenwriter Cesare Zavattini, entitled "The Children Are Watching Us," and I've seen the film. It's not a great film, but it's an interesting film, and there are some remarkable moments in it. The title tells you something about the neorealist commitment to focus on the underprivileged and the disempowered in society. Many neorealist films focus directly on children. And The Children Are Watching Us is one such film. And it almost announces the idea that children are among the victims of society because they are subjected not only to all the political and social authorities of the society, but also to the arbitrary authority of their own parents and their own immediate family environment. So The Children Are Watching Us announces this interest in the disenfranchised, and especially in children, and it's a film about the breakup of a middle-class marriage, mostly told through the eyes of the children. So there are certain things, certain behaviors on the part of the adults are never fully explained because you witness and experience the film through not just the eyes, but through the perceptions, the understanding, the sensibility of children who are somewhat confused about what they're seeing. The film that established him as an international figure and established neorealism as an international movement was one that De Sica and Zavattini collaborated on in 1946, and it was entitled Shoeshine. And I sometimes have been tempted to show Shoeshine in this course, even though it's a much less perfect film than Bicycle Thieves, because in its own way, it's so powerful and moving. One of the most interesting things about neorealism, apart from the fact that it was so short-lived, is how relevant the films still feel today. If you watch Shoeshine, or another of the films that I've listed here, Umberto D, which is about the problems of people who have gone into it, of the old. It's the people who are retired, pensioners, and the problems they face when there is horrific inflation. De Sica dedicated that film to his father. And it's about an old man who's very proud. He he dresses very well, but he's tremendously isolated. He's terribly poor. He's almost reduced to begging in the course of the film. And there's even a moment near the end of the film where he contemplates and then pulls back from suicide. But watching that film today, it feels much less dated than some films that are much later that were produced 10, 15, 20, 25 years after it, because the theme is so relevant. I mean, because we know that in society today, there are so many, in all Western societies, but especially in the United States, there are pensioners who can't make ends meet. And the same thing is true, I think, in some degree of the fate of children in modern society. So Shoeshine, although it has a very melodramatic and violent ending, it's an immensely powerful film. Essentially, it's a story about two boys, two Roman street urchins, who are taken advantage of, in some sense, by their own relatives, who are trafficking in black market goods. It's just the same. It's set in the same moment at the end of the war. In fact, the film opens with these urchins trying to make a living as shoeshine boys. That's where the title comes from. And these shoeshine boys are wandering the streets of Rome, going up to American soldiers who are dominating the streets. It's still an occupied city, asking soldiers if they want shoeshines. The children are unbelievable victims. They're very close friends. They end up buying a racehorse, a broken down old racehorse that can't race anymore, and they stable it someplace. And they're very excited about their possession of this horse. And there's some early scenes in which you see them riding on the horse with tremendous joy and so forth. But of course, this is the dawn before the miserable night, because what then happens is the kids are taken advantage of by by a close relative. They're involved in black market activities. The adults use the children because they know that the children are less vulnerable than they would be if they're caught. The children are caught, they're sent to reform school. And most of the film takes place in the reform school. And you see these two bright-eyed, beautiful young children, maybe 10 years old, who are the fastest and closest of friends when they go into jail, slowly breaking down. You see their humanity being beaten out of them by the conditions in the in the children's prison. It's a terrible, disturbing film in part because you can see that the people who are running the prison actually mean well. They're not vicious, evil people who want to harm children. They just can't. The system seems designed simply to cause more harm than good, and to destroy the vitality and optimism in kids. And when I say the film ends melodramatically, one child strikes out at his erstwhile best friend and knocks him down a bank, and he dies. So he in effect accidentally murders a person who had been his dearest friend. And I think it's a failure in the film. I think that you didn't need the murder for the meanings of the film to be available. And I think that Sica learned something from that. And when you watch the ending of The Bicycle Thief, one of the things I hope you'll ask yourself is, why is it so apparently undramatic? And why does that undramatic ending in the end seem so profound, so moving, so meaningful? It's as if Sica sort of learned his lesson. It's as if he drove his point home too heavily at the end of Shoeshine, and he realized that to have a truly organic text that did what Bazin wants text to do, reflect the unique ambiguity of every experience, the ending of Bicycle Thieves does that much more effectively, as I hope you'll watch for when you're watching the film. So Shoeshine made a tremendous impact, and it won the first of 4 Academy Awards that Sica won as Best Director. This was for the Best Foreign Film of the Year in 1946, and it put Neorealism on the map. And then, 2 years later, Zavattini and Sica followed with what I suppose we could call their masterpiece, Bicycle Thieves. I want to say, this is not a remotely complete list of Sica's films. I've just listed some highlights here because I want to give you a sense of his work. I've mentioned Umberto D already, the last neorealist film, according to many people. And a very moving one about an old pensioner. The film Two Women starred Sophia Loren, one of the great sort of pulchritudinous Italian movie stars of the 50s and 60s, and it got a lot of attention. And there were many other interesting films that he made. But one of his great triumphs was the very last film he made, and that's why I want to mention it. Zavattini returned to do an uncredited co-screenplay work, to do uncredited screenplay work on Finzi Contini, and you can feel Zavattini's hand in many moments in the film. It's an adaptation of a novel, and of course, as some of you may know, it's really a Holocaust film. It's about the build-up to the Holocaust, and the Finzi Contini are very wealthy Italian Jews. The story is about a poor young Jewish scholar who is, because of the anti-Jewish laws that are developing in fascist Italy, is barred from using the public library. And he's a very gifted young scholar. He's in his early 20s. So he finds out that this very wealthy aristocratic family, also Jewish, the Finzi Contini, have a magnificent library. And the Finzi Contini open their library to him, since he's barred from going to public library. And of course, what happens is, you might guess this too. It's a wonderful novel, although the film is even more beautiful, I think. He falls in love with the Finzi Contini daughter, right? So it's a class issue, you know, the poor boy, rich girl. So the foreground of the film is this cross-class romance. But in the background of the film, it's something like Cabaret, but not as dramatic, not as overt. Because what's going on in the background of the film is the growth of fascism. And the film ends with many of the characters we've gotten to know very well, both young and old, all of them Jews, some very aristocratic and some at the bottom of the social hierarchy, all being herded together, being ready to be shipped off to the camps. You don't actually go, the final scenes of the film have them in the railroad station being prepared for their final journey. The film is also full of comedy, just as some of the passages that I showed you in clips this afternoon mix comedy with socially serious themes. This is even truer of the Garden of the Finzi Contini. So one of the reasons I like the film so much is that it's a return to the energies and the moral passion that had marked De Sica's earlier career. And I think that my own feeling is the Garden of the Finzi Contini is one of the great European films. It certainly would be on my list of the best 15 or 20 European films of the sound era. I think many of you would find it very instructive and moving, but I think especially so after you saw some of the true neorealist films, the early neorealist films. One can't really call The Garden of the Finzi Contini a neorealist film, although it has many elements in common with those earlier texts. So De Sica was a remarkable man, a significant actor, a great director. He directed he directed 25 films in his career, won 4 Oscars for Best Foreign Film. He acted in more than 150 films, mostly light, comic, social manners kind of roles. But there's one exception I perhaps should mention. Playing in a film for his friend, Roberto Rossellini, in 1959, Rossellini's greatest film, a film called General della Rovere, De Sica played the lead. He plays the general, and it's probably his most memorable performance. And it's a very, very subtle and good film about political ambiguities and conflicts of loyalty. And human frailty, human inadequacy in a way that's characteristic of the best neorealist work. So those are all films I recommend and urge you to consider watching in your leisure time. Let me say a few words now about Bicycle Thieves. And I've already implied, or actually said, a part of what I want to say, so I think I can be briefer than I had originally planned. Let me remind you again about the structure. I've mentioned to you that the structure of the film is elegantly simple, that the amount of time that passes is very compressed, and that's helpful because the time compression makes you aware of the urgency of the quest that the father and the son are engaged on when they're searching for the bicycle. So one way, and as the story unfolds, a number of things begin to happen. The quest for the bicycle becomes a kind of odyssey in which several things happen. One is the film takes you on an exploration of Rome. It's like one of the great city films. It visits the city, it explores the city. You see different, it's not just that you see police stations and religious institutions and the catacombs underneath the city where the unions meet, and where Ricci first goes to get help from union members who promise him that they'll find his bike very easily, and they give him a plan, and he's very excited. And then the next morning when they follow the instructions of the union boss, doesn't help. So the unions are breaking down, as well as the church, as well as certain kinds of welfare organizations from the state and so on. So one thing the film becomes then is a kind of travelogue, a kind of exploration of the city's geography, as well as the city's makeup in some way. You go into different neighborhoods and you hear, I think Italians can pick up different neighborhood speech patterns in the film. At least I've been told this by native Italians. So it's a kind of travelogue in one sense. It explores this place. And part of the exploration, of course, part of the exploration involves certain ancillary or other themes that are organically linked to the story of going through the city looking for the bicycle. And one of these, of course, is what we might call the social themes of the film, because as the protagonists make their way through the city searching for the bicycle, what you encounter are little vignettes that tell you something about the social hierarchies of the society, about the efficacy or inefficacy of its institutions, right? I won't go into great detail here. I hope you'll draw your own conclusions and name some of the specific examples that reinforce this general idea. But I do want to mention at least one moment in this Odyssey. One of the most dramatic and disturbingly comic moments in the film occurs when Ricci and his son actually think they've seen the thief. They think they recognize him, and they follow him, and they get to essentially a mission where relatively well-off, self-satisfied Christians are serving meals to the indigent and the poor, right? And Ricci gets into this institution not because he sort of wants the meal or because he needs the religious uplift, but because he's chasing his thief, right? And he finds once he's in there that he can't get out. It turns out that in this institution, not only do the poor have to pay for their meal by agreeing to all kinds of religious behaviors, prayers and other kinds of things, but they're also locked into the building. They're not allowed to eat. They're not allowed to leave, at least until they finish eating. Maybe they're not allowed to leave until they can be checked to make sure they're not stealing the soup bowls. But in any case, it's a very interesting moment, because you can see that even the people who intend to do well in the society often do more harm than good. And of course, the implication is that the traditional religious institutions and traditional religious arrangements are not sufficient to take care of or adequately to respect the difficulties of the poor. And that's just one such moment. I mean, there are a number of others. And in fact, there is one other moment I should mention as a kind of contrast. I've said that we see many instances in which we understand that the larger institutions of society, like the police or the religious system or the union system, are breaking down or not really helping people. But I've also said that there are some other sort of unofficial and non-institutionalized sources of solidarity and comfort that emerge in the course of the film, and I hope you'll watch for them and think about what their significance is. But there's one moment in which we might say, which complicates this argument, because we can see the social institutions of society not actually functioning effectively, but at least showing some compassion. And it's an astonishingly vivid, meaningful moment in the film. Another one of these moments so full of multiplicity that the meanings are so deeply embedded in what you dramatically see that sometimes you don't even step back to generalize on the meaning of what you've seen. And this is a scene very early in the film where Ricci actually goes to retrieve his bicycle. And his wife has figured out a way. Basically, what she figures out is they have a little bit. They sell her dowry. She has a couple of fancy silk sheets, and they take them to the hock shop, and And they pawn the sheets in order to get enough money to get the bicycle out of hock, right? It means they're going to be sleeping on mattresses, but so what? This is more important, right? And you see Ricci and his wife go to the pawn shop, which is clearly run by the state. It's not like a private pawn. It's obviously a city institution of some kind. And they bring the linen up to the guy, and he looks at them and he says, "Okay, I'll give you this much money." And they need a little bit more because they need more to get the bike out of hock. So they ask him for more money, and he looks at it, he says, it's not really worth it. Okay. And he gives and it's an act of generosity on his part because he didn't have to do it. He gives them just enough money for this stuff so that they can get his bike out of hock. And then, completely silent, you see him pick this material up, this pawned bedding, this pawned linen. And he turns around, I think he does it. He may give it to another character. I haven't looked at this scene in a year or two, so I don't remember but you'll recognize the scene. I think it's the same man who does it, or he may give it to someone else. The material, the 3 or 4 sheets that are involved are taken by someone. He walks to the back of a room, and he begins to climb a ladder. And as he climbs, you realize that what he's climbing up is he's climbing a ladder which is leaning against a series of shelves that seem to go on endlessly. They seem to be in an auditorium the size of the city of Pittsburgh. And they go up endlessly high. And every single shelf, every single inch of space on the shelf is filled with bedding, as if the entire city of Rome has pawned its bedding. As if everybody in Rome is sleeping on mattresses. Now, the film never makes a comment about this. No one in the film says anything about it. But it's an unbelievably resonant and rich moment. And it's also, it does further the sort of social themes of the film, but it occurs in a moment in which you also see the pawnbroker showing a moment of compassion and generosity. And if he did not show that generosity, they wouldn't have been able to get the bicycle. So it's a complicated moment. It does, I mean, if all this linen has been pawned, there's some question about whether or not the city services are doing much good for anybody. The city's in obvious trouble if nobody has any bed linen any longer. The implication is this is an unbelievably impoverished and damaged environment. But it's done in such a quiet, and it's done in such a quiet way. There's even something almost comic about the sense you have of the endless number of these things. Even the idea that you have to distinguish one from the other seems, from our vantage point, a bit silly, even though each one has a ticket on it, each one belongs to an individual family. So watch for that moment. It has some of that ambiguity that Bazin talks about. So the structure of the film is organic in the sense that nothing that happens in the film doesn't seem to arise naturally out of the needs of the characters. We have to find our new bike, we have to find our bike, and in the course of their travels, other things happen. The boy has to pee, they get hungry, they have to eat, or sometimes it rains, they have to get out of the rain, right? And that becomes part of the ongoing sort of organic development of the story. You never once feel, I think, in this film, that any event has been imposed from the outside. Every event seems to arise naturally out of the circumstances and nature of the characters. And that's why I call it organic. It's a deeply organic way of thinking about the material. But it's organic in another way too, of course, because it's deeply coherent. When you finally finish the film and you step back, you say, okay, yes, the film slowed down here, and yes, the film seemed to generate what Thorburn calls a counterplot here. Nonetheless, taken as a whole, there's a profound moral and thematic coherence in this organically fluid movie. So the structure of the film is part of its essence. And although I haven't put this on the outline because we've talked about this so often already, pay attention to the Renoirish type camera behavior. I mean, the film's visual style is like Jean Renoir's. There's a kind of elegant restlessness to the camera that's very much a part of what the film achieves. So in talking about the social themes, all I meant to call your attention to was the extent to which, in a variety of ways, the film calls attention to the miserably endangered circumstances of ordinary people in this broken down, war-torn environment. And it also looks to those, or seems to find, without even looking, to those or dramatize or reveal those sources of support and sustenance that get us through bad times. And as you're watching the ending of the film, ask yourself what these things mean. I mean, what it means that whether I won't actually tell you whether he recovers the bike or not. Let you see that for yourselves. But ask yourself whether or not he recovers the bike. Would it have made any difference? Does it matter? Given what the film is finally saying to us in those final images. Well, character. This is one of the great films about character, I think, and especially about the relation between the father and the son. They're at the very center of the film. I've already said, in a way, that this odyssey that they go on is a travelogue. It teaches us about the geography and social circumstances and social arrangements and class system and institutional systems of Rome. It does that. But it's also an odyssey in which the father and the son get to know each other in a deeper and in many ways much more disturbing way than has ever happened to them before. The most poignant and terrible thing about this film, in fact, is that the odyssey I've been describing through Rome with his son by Ricci is also an initiation story, a story about growing up. But what happens to Ricci's son in this film doesn't happen to most young boys until they're much older. And it happens gradually, not all at once. But what Ricci's son discovers in the course of this day are his father's flaws. He discovers things about his father that no boy really wants to know, even if he's 67 years old, like your professor. And he discovers these things about his father in the most stressful circumstances. His father is violent toward him. His father is indifferent toward him. Then there are moments when, after his father feels terrible anxiety and grief over the way he's treated him, where his father tries to make up with him. And you can see the boy not wanting to let him do it. It's unbelievably rich. And I don't think anyone who pays attention to this will fail to recognize the interactions between the father and son as unbelievably true, marvelously accurate to the way in which loving parents and loving children often interact with each other, because they have many moments where they're really not happy with each other at all. What the boy discovers about his father are some things that no child ever wants to know about his father. Not just that he's flawed, but that he's deeply, deeply flawed, that he's capable of really terrible behavior. And the boy and something then happens in this odyssey. It's one of the subtlest things about the film. The basic relations between fathers and sons are reversed. And we find that the son, this little child, is twice in the film in the position of having to rescue his father. I'm simplifying certain things because I don't want to give away the plot, but you'll see how this works out in the film. I mean, there are two moments in the film in which Ricci's fate would be far more dire than it is because of his son's presence. His son, in a sense, is his savior. So that the fathers are supposed to protect their sons, not the reverse. And part of the meaning of this adventure is that Ricci has been reduced to such a miserable level that he even has to rely on his son's help in order to get by. And both of them, father and son, experience this reversal. So it's a psychologically traumatic and deeply moving experience. Although, don't misunderstand, I'm not suggesting that the child doesn't come to terms with he does come to terms with what he learns. I think it's quite remarkable. I would have had trouble with what that boy comes to terms with as an adult, and he does it as a child. But I think, of course, it's also believable, as you'll see. So the film is profound and serious about the social circumstances of post-war Italy. It's profound and serious about the indifference of certain kinds of institutional arrangements to the real miseries of human experience. And it is a powerful and deep exploration of human character, and especially, centrally, the relation between Ricci and his son, the relation between fathers and sons, becomes a kind of one of the great parables of the relations between adults and children, between father. It's one of the great father and son stories of all time. Let me conclude by saying a couple of words about the title. I mean, there's much more in the film I wish I could talk about, but by this time in the course, if you can't get this stuff yourself, I haven't done my job. I hope all of you are watching films much more attentively and carefully than you had before. I hope that your enjoyment has been increased rather than decreased by what you've learned in this course. And let The Bicycle Thief be a test, because in many ways, it's not the kind of film most of you guys would go out to watch. First of all, it's in black and white. Second, it's whatever it is, more than 50 years old. but I think you'll recognize that it hasn't aged, that the film is as compelling now as it was when it was, maybe even more compelling now than when it was made, because some of the political turmoil has disappeared. There's no longer the taint of fascism hanging over Italian artistic productions as there were at the end of the war. There's a historical sense of the importance of this movement. So maybe we can look at these neorealist films with a more objective eye than the original audiences could. In any case, the title is an interesting one. When it was first translated into English, it was, and in fact it's still widely known, you might have noticed a few slips of the tongue on my part where I started to call it The Bicycle Thief. And the reason is, it's still often called that. And when it was originally brought into the United States and translated both in Great Britain and in the United States, it was called The Bicycle Thief. Now the Italian is in the plural, it's ladri di biciclette. Thieves of the bicycle would be the literal translation, right? Now the question is, why the plural? And I think you can imagine the answer just from that opening sequence that I showed you this afternoon. Why would it be plural? Why would the title be plural? One of the reasons is, from the very opening sequence, we see that everybody, first that the bicycle is a very ambiguous and complicated symbol in the film. Symbol is a bad word because it's such an actuality that it seems pretentious to call it a symbol. You see hundreds of, maybe thousands of bicycles in the film. That's part of what makes Ricci's loss of the bicycle so poignant. You have the sense as he's walking around the city that, my God, everybody has a bicycle. There are 10 million bicycles in this city. Poor Ricci can't find one, can't find his, it seemed, I mean, there's something horrific about the idea that an item so common could still, for Ricci, be so precious as to constitute his livelihood, or a threat against his livelihood if he can't find the bicycle. And you can guess now, on the basis of what I've already said, one reason for why the title is plural. Why? As Ricci's walking around looking for his bicycle, walking through a city full of hundreds and thousands of bicycles, what might he think? What might you think if you needed the bicycle desperately? Why not pinch one? Right, why not thief? So one of the reasons that the title is plural is that Ricci's one of the thieves, right? I mean, I'm only suggesting that he's a thief by sort of psychological inclination. He looks lovingly at bicycles. As you'll see, the plot makes this even more explicit. I don't want to give away the plot. He actually does, in a certain sense, become a thief. But long before he becomes a literal thief and actually puts his hands on someone else's bicycle, and I even think that some people in the audience may get the idea before Ricci does. I mean, you're watching this guy so terrible, looking every place for his bicycle, and he's surrounded by bicycles. He's inundated by bicycles. After he recovers the bicycle, before he goes to work, his wife asks him to take him to a special location. She wants to thank someone. It turns out and they get on the bike, she rides behind him, and he rides over on the bike, and he waits outside this place when his wife goes up. His wife is taking a long time, so he leans his bike against the wall, and he starts to go up the stairs, and he sees that his bike is vulnerable, so he walks down, and he finds a kid, and I think he gives the kid a coin, and tells the kid to guard the bike. And then he starts walking up the stairs again. This is very early in the film, and think how clever this is. And you're aware of how vulnerable the bike is from that moment. This is a day before it's stolen, right? And you're aware of how precious it is. And as he ascends the stairs, you actually become afraid that his bicycle might be stolen, right? So that one of the reasons that the title is ambiguous is, I think in the end, that the title encompasses not just the thief who steals Ricci's bike, and not just Ricci himself, who contemplates becoming a thief in his desperation, but also the audience, which becomes complicit in Ricci's impulse to criminality, because we ourselves think, God, steal the goddamn bike, take the bike. Stop worrying about it. Get it. Get away. There's a bike you can take. And I think anyone watching the film has this feeling after a relatively short time, so that we're bicycle thieves as well. So part of the subtlety of the and you'll see as the film works itself out, I've already implied this, when they finally catch up with the thief, the guy they think is the thief, he turns out to be an even more miserable specimen than poor Ricci. He's an epileptic. He's out of work. He has to be protected by his community. His mother's very protective of him. There's some minor possibility that he's acting, that he's faking his mental problems and maybe faking everything. But I don't think so. I mean, and you can judge yourself whether this is, what is in any case the case. What is in any case surely true is that the neighborhood coalesces around him because Ricci and his son are strangers and are attacking someone from their neighborhood, right? So when this happens, one of the things that you feel is not just that the thief that Ricci was going after deserves some sympathy too. You begin to feel some sense that his difficulties are not that you excuse his thievery, but you understand it in a deep and generous way, I think. And that complicates your sense of who thieves are and what thieves are like. And then you've come to recognize that Ricci's a potential thief. And you care about Ricci. You see what a loving father he is, how desperate he is to take care of his family. So you sympathize with him. And then you realize, if you've been thinking about it, that of course you've been coveting bicycles yourself. So the audience and the real thief and Ricci, the would-be thief, are all implicated together, as if what he's saying is that our common humanity is what Bicycle Thieves suggests. And that's one of the reasons that the title needs to be plural, because the film is not about a single bicycle thief. It's about the bicycle thief in all of us. Enjoy the film.